We are taking a look at the death of Zimbabwe's longtime leader, Robert Mugabe. Shaka, people all over the world are still mourning the death of Zimbabwe's longtime leader, Robert Mugabe, who passed away last week. And as we speak, the body is yet to be repatriated back to Zimbabwe. Your thoughts?
Well, they have to mourn him, obviously, because he was a human being. And as a human being, you have people looking at him through different lenses of their experience. It's like what they say sometimes about beauty. They say that, in fact, if you want to understand beauty very well, you should listen to those who say that beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. So people like Robert Gabriel Mugabe.
I like your analogy.
People like Robert Gabriel Mugabe, he was a man who obviously had supporters. He was a man who did great things at the beginning of his career when he became the essentially independence Zimbabwean leader, really, because, by the way, before he became the executive prime minister in 1980, there was a country called Rhodesia, which had been under rebel Prime Minister Ian Smith. And earlier, that Rhodesia was part of territory that was a personal, really, property of a man who the British call Sir John Cecil Rhodes. That was the man who owned that particular territory. Zimbabwe became a country after independence on April 18, 1980, being led by the executive prime minister, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, arguably one of the most educated individuals to hold that position. Even though some people will tell you later that in later years, that education didn't seem very much to reflect what was happening on the ground.
Shaka, going back to the analogy you made earlier, looking at Zimbabwe in the context of beauty, Mugabe, like you rightly said, had a lot of supporters, and I was even surprised to see a lot of African presidents admired that guy or revered that guy from the kind of condolences messages they've been sending. It looks like Mugabe was one of those heroes that a lot of them looked up to. But on the other hand, Mugabe had a lot of critics, especially the West did not like Mugabe precisely because maybe he gave back land to a lot of Africans. Africans said that it was because of that land that a lot of Western countries decided to part ways with him.
You know, that land, when you talk about land, almost anywhere, it is a very emotive type of situation. But in the particular case of Zimbabwe, really, when you think about it, land, the majority of the arable land for a very, very long time was in the hands of a minority white commercial farmers. And the indigenous Zimbabweans at the time pretty much lived on the edges, really. They lived in the arid type of land, or some land that is almost like semi-desert and all that kind of stuff, and obviously not very productive. And when you read the history of that territory and its surrounding areas, there is incontrovertible evidence, for example, that those people initially who took over that land did not, in fact, pay for it. They essentially conquered the territory by force of arms. They killed some of the natives that they had found there, appropriated the land that belonged to certain specific individuals and all that kind of stuff. And of course, put in place a legal sort of regime, which obviously became the law that protected them. Having said that, after so many years, you had these emerging African liberation movements, and Mugabe was one of those key leaders who eventually ended up leading what is now called ZANU-PF, which obviously gave a lot of hard time to the rebel Prime Minister Ian Smith when he declared back in early 60s, when he declared the unilateral declaration of independence from the British, because he feared that the British, having given independence to a lot of African countries, beginning with Ghana in March 1957, the minority whites led by Ian Smith feared that this land would actually eventually be controlled by the majority indigenous Africans. And so they seized power, and the Africans decided that they were definitely going to fight for their freedom. And eventually, when you end up at the Lancaster Independence Conference in 1979, if I remember my years correctly, they came up with a constitution. And by the way, Paul, a written constitution in this particular case by a country, Great Britain at the time, which has the distinction of in fact having a constitution that is not written down. The British have an unwritten constitution, but they end up in the business of making sure that if you get independence from them when they were colonialists, they actually write a constitution for you. And in that particular constitution, they actually left in what people or analysts call a sort of social, cultural, political time bomb. The land issue was not supposed to be really dealt with, at least for the first 10 years of political independence of what became Zimbabwe. That was really the problem that eventually Mugabe had to deal with, because he had played all the other cards that he had, and to reach the point where he still needed to hang on to power. But in order for him to hang on to power, he had to be able to have something that he would provide for the Zimbabwean people in order for them to accept him to be their ruler or governor, whatever you may want to choose. Mugabe started as a remarkably popular leader, especially because he came up with perhaps one of the best educational policies on the African continent, and perhaps anywhere really for that matter. And he also came up with a very good policy of health care, and you name it. So he seemed to be really a man on the move. He seemed to be a man that really was there for the ordinary Zimbabwean. But towards the end, Paul, it became a different ball game, because when he decided to deal with that land issue, he did not have support from his Western partners. And his Western partners decided to hit him left and right with sanctions and you name it. And hence, the beginning of the end, really, of Zimbabwe as the world had come to know it.
Just a quick follow-up. A lot of people talk about the land issue as a 2000, 1999, 98, 2000 issue. But this goes back to the Lancaster Agreement. One of the things that they signed at that time was the land, how land was going to be given back to ordinary or indigenous Africans.
No, they did not. They decided that you were not to touch the land issue for the first 10 years. After 10 years, essentially there were these diplomatic, discussions and what have you and stuff like that. There was some kind of agreement between the government of Robert Mugabe and the government of Britain. They decided that they were going to provide some funding. In fact, this was, by the way, largely supported by the United States under the Jimmy Carter administration. I was an undergraduate student in upstate New York, and I remember a man called Andrew Young. Andrew Young was an African American who, at the time, was Jimmy Carter's permanent representative to the United Nations. And he was the man, along with, I believe it was I think, John Owen. It was the foreign secretary of the British government. They were the ones that negotiating really how to go around in terms of putting together a package that eventually would be used to buy out some of these white farmers on what was considered to be willing seller and willing buyer, you know, that kind of policy. And unlike, for example, in Kenya, where that was executed under Jomo Kenyatta, so that eventually, in fact, the land that was owned to the settler community, the white settler community, was passed on to the Kenyan elite, not to the ordinary people. In Zimbabwe, yes, the fund, in fact, was initially disbursed under Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. It continued to be disbursed under Prime Minister John Major. But when Tony Blair came into office, then the policy changed significantly. That was the beginning, really, of the trouble, of the problems, really, in Zimbabwe.
Let's move on, Shaka. Let's go to a quicker comment here from Georgia Mulungana. Shaka, if you had a choice between Mugabe, who a lot of people have called their hero, and Mandela, who do you consider a hero?
Well, to be honest with you, the issue of considering somebody a hero, again, is like the issue of love. It is in the eyes of the beholder.
I like how you're using that analogy, Shaka, today.
It is in the eyes of the beholder. There are people clearly who believe that each of these particular individuals is a hero in his own way, even though on balance, most probably would agree that Mandela, the Madiba, is a hero.
But there are those who say he's a sellout. He sold out. He never gave land to black South Africans.
Precisely. As a matter of fact, there are people in South Africa and in Africa who say that the people who consider Mandela as a hero are the people that held land, held property, and never lost it. And those that had nothing, for some reason, they look at him through different lenses, really. But let's face it, you have a man here who spent 27 and a half years as a prisoner on Robben Island and other places because he was fighting for freedom, and not only the freedom for Nelson Mandela, but the freedom, in fact, for people who looked like him in South Africa.
But you could make the same argument about Mugabe. He was also incarcerated for at least 10 years. He was fighting for the same freedom that you're talking about.
Yes, yes. But again, you see, Mandela, he did practice what you would call reconciliation. And not only that, he was not politically a greedy leader. Mandela was so popular, Paul, in South Africa, to the extent that, in fact, even if he had died in office or died, his body, most South Africans probably would even vote for his body to be the president of South Africa. Now, given the kind of popularity that this man commanded, this man, after the first term of office, 5 years, the man decided to retire and hand over power to the man who had been number 2 man. He anointed him Thabo Mbeki, even though, by the way, reports at the time suggested that he actually was leaning largely towards a guy called Cyril Ramaphosa. But Cyril Ramaphosa, having never lived in exile, having stayed in South Africa and did his thing really as a lawyer through the trade union and all that kind of stuff and through negotiations, the ANC, which was largely controlled by the elements who had actually been in exile, they did not feel comfortable with that, and they went with Thabo Mbeki.
Let's stay in South Africa. Let's go to what a lot of people have characterized as something that shouldn't be happening in South Africa, the xenophobia attacks. Let's start with Stanley Kongomon. What causes xenophobia in South Africa?
I think there are so many factors, Paul, but one of them is that you are talking about a people, the indigenous South African blacks, were denied, for example, education. They had a different type of education, which is largely different from what you and I know. They had what they called Bantu education. And this was government policy, apartheid government policy. They were never supposed to acquire modern skills so that they could actually live a very productive life. They were basically supposed to occupy the role of being a slave, really, being a servant, perpetually a servant of the white man. They obviously, as a result of the manner in which they were treated, they lost confidence in themselves. They became very insecure, let's face it. And by the time they got independence in South Africa, 1994, they did not have the skills to run a modern nation state, except to those South African blacks who had actually been living in exile. They are the ones, ironically, who acquired higher education and acquired some skill sets and all that kind of stuff. But the majority, the vast majority of the South African black people within South Africa, they did not. And therefore, when you look at the policies of apartheid, you look at the centuries of white settler type of colonialism that, in fact, was distinct, for example, from the type of colonialism that people experienced in a country like Uganda, in a country like Ghana, a country like Nigeria. These people were traumatized through that type of experience that lasted for many, many, many decades.
But how about people who argue that these Africans that are being attacked in a way contributed immensely to the kind of prosperity that we see in South Africa? A lot of South Africans had to leave that country to go elsewhere, really to where they were accommodated, or some were refugees in all these other African countries. And the same people who are attacking these people, some of them were direct beneficiaries of those people who are seeking refugees in other countries.
Yes, but I think that you are looking really at a different time period here. Xenophobia really comes up after what you would call the liberation of South Africa, the all-race type of democracy, which was championed by Nelson Mandela, the Madiba, after 1994. Those who were in South Africa before, coming from different African countries and what have you, were not working in the type of South Africa that we are looking at right now. They were working in a South Africa that was part of what was called Bantustans. The Bantustans that were never recognized, by the way, by the international community, not the United Nations. Not even the United States, in fact, recognized the Bantustan, even though under the Reagan administration, In some sense, one could say the U.S. sort of supported apartheid because it adopted a policy of constructive engagement. Constructive engagement, and for the most part, really used to, in a sense, be pretty much perceived to be on the side of the white minority rule. I mean, to the extent that I remember there was a Senator McGovern, a Democratic Party, senator, who one time visited South Africa and he had to fill forms. And when he was filling forms, there was a category which asked you to list your race. And he actually filled the form as human race. Very interesting.
Let's go to some Nayala James. He says, how can we bring together Africans as a family, especially in light of what we're talking about, xenophobia attacks in South Africa?
I think we need to, first of all, think very, very seriously about how to embrace what I would call social, economic, political justice for all of us. And that can only come about if we embrace what really is something that is pretty much a deficit on the African continent, which is democracy. We need to have a democracy that results, for example, in an election, not a selection managed by an individual who happen to have advantages, but actually an election that is conducted by an independent electoral commission, which at the end of the day announces results that in fact reflect the will of the voter, the will of the people, not the will of the individuals who are counting the vote, not the will of the individual who announces the election results, like we have seen in many, many African countries. That is not to say that there are no democratic countries or emerging democratic countries on the African continent. There are some, but there are still very, very few.
Shaka, there is a quick follow-up here. What does xenophobic attacks, Africans, South African, black Africans are killing Africans, got to do with elections and having democratic governance?
Of course, it has everything to do with social, economic, political injustice. First of all, you have these legitimate South African indigenous black people, who I say when you look in history, they were denied the right type of education. They were denied the opportunity to acquire modern skills that they would employ in a modern nation-state type of economy. And they see people who look like them, who come from, for example, north of Limpopo, coming as engineers, coming as doctors, coming as business people, coming with the skills that they were denied for a very long time, and therefore taking the type of jobs which they feel belongs to them. And so, to be honest with you, it's, I think, an issue of humanity. These are people who, in a sense, have been raised up in circumstances that have essentially made them feel very insecure. They have such a very sort of insecurity type of complex. And frankly, there's no any other way you can explain it except that when they look at people who look like them, who dress better like them, who live in better neighborhoods, who have better jobs, better professions, and what have you, the only reason they think that those people have is because those people had advantages over them. And they don't have much really they can do about it. And therefore, they are basically getting into the business of scapegoating, other people at the expense of the weaknesses that they are suffering from. And therefore, the government actually of South Africa should really step in and sort of come up with a sort of Marshall Plan, especially for the younger South Africans. Make sure that education, for example, is available to every young South African, so that at the end of the day, the young South Africans can look forward to acquiring a quality type of education that assures them to get the kind of modern skills that they really need.
But
South
is that going to
Africans
change the
can be loyal.
mindset?
It may not change immediately, but at least it will give a sense of hope so that people can now know that they are basically in a position where they can benefit out of the opportunities that have been created. Because let's face it, unless you do something about it, South Africa is going to be a basket case. For example, there was recently the edition of the World Economic Forum. And from what I have read, it looks like it wasn't really as well and blessed as it should have, especially because of the circumstances evolving around xenophobia activities and what have you. You have a situation where, for example, the president of Nigeria, Major General Muhammadu Buhari, a man who obviously is the president of a very, very important African country, and in fact a very important country in the world. For one reason, it is the single largest, it has the distinction of having been the single largest economy in Africa. In terms of population, it has more people than any other country in Africa. And when you think about even Africans really in the diaspora, there are some statistics that suggest that 1 out of every 4 Africans may in fact be a Nigerian. Nigerians have become victims of xenophobia, and the Nigerian government has decided to evacuate those Nigerians who feel that they actually need to leave South Africa. And a company has also offered a plane, and as we talk, they are in fact evacuating Nigerians from South Africa. And back in Nigeria, there is also what you would call retaliatory attacks by Nigerians against South African companies like MTN and what have you.
Yeah, Shaka, we've run out of time. Unfortunately, I look forward to hosting you on another edition. Thank you so much to you all from Washington. This has been a great show. We look forward to hosting you on another edition next week. Until then, so long from Washington.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my good friend, Ms. Lesko, doing a great job representing her constituents in Arizona. This is an issue that has got to be addressed. As my friend said, though, if we defeat the previous question, we will offer my bill, H.R. 4261. When the majority Democrats proposed public financing of campaigns in H.R. 1 at the start of this Congress, I thought it was one of the worst ideas in campaign finance ever. Public financing of campaigns will fill the swamp, and any member who voted for it was voting to fill their own pockets and the pockets of political operatives nationwide. At first, Democrats tried to use the tax dollars of hardworking Americans to fund their public financing sections in H.R. 1. Remember, H.R. 1 was a 622-page